Yuri Rashkin is an educator, presenter, musician, court interpreter, news analyst, and host of the Rashkin Report on YouTube. He's becoming far better known in the community. His content is hugely appreciated through his regular contributions, collaborations with influential Ukrainian journalists and commentators, including Vitalii Portnikov, who's been on this channel recently, and some of you may well have seen that episode. I'm absolutely delighted to have this conversation. I think it's going to go in all sorts of interesting and unique directions. But without further ado, let's get into it. Yuri, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me, Jonathan. It's an honor to be on your channel and your platform because I watch it so often. So it's just great to have this opportunity to speak with you.
It's absolutely brilliant. Well, we'll get in a bit of sort of biography, but I think we're on a similar journey because, your channel is pretty much the same size. Well, it is actually the same size as mine, same kind of demographics, same kind of purpose, I assume. But well, I'll let you describe in your own words how your channel came about, how it's grown to this point, and what you see as, its key purpose.
It's a kind of a self-expression, self-development experience because for a while in 2015 I hosted a talk show on local public radio in Madison, Wisconsin, where I live, and then my schedule changed. I had to take a full load of classes that I was teaching, and I still wanted to do this, so I started doing it on YouTube. And I thought, I like to listen to Russian radio to kind of keep my language skills up a little bit, and I feel like I can bring some of those voices into English and kind of do what you ended up doing so well. But when I started doing it, because of I think very thick accents all over the place, it really didn't go anywhere. But I noticed that there were Russian people who were really like, I mean, I'm speaking to guests whose first language often is Russian, and I'm trying to kind of drag them into English. But if we just go back into their comfort zone of Russian, there's actually a lot of people who would like to hear what they have to say because when they speak to me, being in America, they feel like they're a little more relaxed. They could say things that they couldn't say because either I thought that they were afraid for themselves, but a lot of them were actually afraid for the media platform. They didn't want to get other people in trouble, and so they would self-censor themselves that way. And so I kind of developed a nice little following and grow, started as a podcast and edit video. And I've always been interested in American politics. I'm actually a local elected official in Wisconsin. But I came with my parents when I was 13 from Moscow. In Moscow, I was lived in this kind of privileged life, Patriarch Pond, where Master and Margarita of Bulgakov starts. That's my like playground as a kid. But then I went and I lived for 16 years in Utah, state of Utah, which is wild. And then for the last 20 years in Wisconsin, which is wild in its own way. I don't have my cheese head with me to show you. But little by little, and I feel like every political election season helps. Discussing American politics is bringing me new audiences who are interested in America and have few options to learn about this because I am not a Trump supporter, which is very rare in Russian space. If you get into Russian language space, finding somebody who is willing to talk to you and is not a Trump supporter is just odd. And so because I've never been close to Russian community and I've always kind of lived outside of that, developed my political identity as an American, not as Russian immigrant, that whole dynamic, um, it makes me a little bit unique. And so when the war broke, so I feel like after January 6th, there was an uptick in interest because what is going on in America? And then after the big invasion in 22 of Russia into Ukraine, it turned out that there was a lot of interest about what is America doing? And America really wasn't doing anything to explain to Ukrainians what they were doing outside of interviews that Anthony Blinken would give or Sullivan would give. But they didn't realize that they were being cast as this cast of characters in Ukrainian media, where Sullivan is bad and Blinken is good, and it would be nice if somebody would go in there and explain how things were a little bit, and that's what I ended up doing because nobody else, I guess, was willing to. There was maybe two or three other voices, but I just kind of enjoy doing this kind of work. So they call me and say, "Hey, can you be on a stream? Can you be on the Ukrainian TV in 15 minutes?" I'm like, "Sure. I don't have a court hearing for another half an hour. Let's go do this." And so little by little, I build up a library of, while our channels are kind of very similar in terms of numbers, I have almost over 5,000 videos that have been produced at this point. And I enjoy several things, one of which is reading news. So I developed that as a thing on its own, where I do things in a hello, this is America speaks voice of America. Now that there is no voice of America, I can just say it, like, well, bring me another one. I don't see another Voice of America. Unfortunately, I'd love to. I would love to hear Voice of America with huge budgets like Russia Today. Wouldn't that be great? But
That would be
I
nice.
also,
Tenet Media. Rename yourself as Tenet
yeah,
Media. Yeah.
oh, for sure. Voice of Trump. Yeah, and it's going to be exciting. But I also enjoy speaking to people and listening to them. And even though right now I'm speaking without stopping, but I really enjoy just speaking with somebody like Vitalii Portnikov, where I can ask him a question and then just sit and not interrupt. And it's so nice because there is no urgency. We're just having a conversation. And I feel the way he explained it to me is because I was basically the only one standing up against this entire propaganda machine, that he felt like he wanted to support me in this way. And so we've been doing every 2 weeks, we get together and we have, a cup of coffee, or well, I guess he drinks like tea, but whatever. And we just discuss things and what the situation is. And I have developed these regular streams with Vitalii Portnikov, who is, I feel like, the preeminent journalist, but also Roman Cymbaluk, who is extremely popular and
He's
just
he's
really
good,
great.
isn't he? And he's one of the go-to commentators that I regularly watch as well. Yeah.
Yes, and it has just been great because Raman is a nice guy in person, but at the press conference, he was the one who was asking Putin some tough questions after annexation of Crimea, and that's how he first came to my attention. I was like, wow, this brave journalist. And so I went to Ukraine this past August because I thought I've been doing so much media work in Ukraine, I should go check it out because I actually never been. Even though it turned out that I have roots going back there because I was a so-called Russian Jew. And there are no really Russian Jews, as Vitaly Portnikov explained to me, because they all came from Ukraine, which is true, because they couldn't live in Russia. So I guess my roots do go back to Ukraine. I like to think that my roots go back to Patriarch Pond in Moscow, but looking a little deeper, they go back to Ukraine. And so visiting that really different, interesting place, I got to know Roman Cymbaluk, and we started doing streams on regular basis. Every week we get together. He has I would say, a more positive, hopeful outlook towards what American administration is capable of. I have a more kind of a sour outlook on what American administration is likely to do, and we kind of trade this kind of a conversation back and forth. And so I feel very fortunate that I've been able to kind of build a bridge a little bit between America and Ukraine and the flag behind me. People ask me, especially in Ukraine, like, Yuri, you need to fix this. And I understand that this is not the right way, but I'm trying to send a message because I got this flag in Ukraine, in Kyiv in August of last year, and I loved it. I thought it's so great. This is like, allies. This is so important. And I hung it up here, and it was great. And then we know what happened. And I got tired of trying to explain what I felt was obvious. Only after Zelensky was attacked by Trump and Vance at the White House on February 28th, one of our national days of shame, that people really in Ukraine woke up and they went, you know what? I don't think that Trump is going to do much good for Ukraine. And so I think that that message became even more clear, which is we're in distress. There is a relationship, and the relationship is in distress.
And the relationship with other allies as well. We'll come into that in a minute. I mean, I feel myself partly culpable for the whole Sullivan bashing because one of the purposes of my channel was to listen to some Russian language commentators like Michael Naki, Milov, and others. Some of I would say, the better voices, not how should I call it, systemic opposition. But there are some great voices there. And then, of course, there's Portnikov and there's Tsymbylyuk, and there's kind of several others who I think have really concentrated information and really fantastic analysis, which emerges from a far better set of data and understanding what's going around. And of course, they have teams who will trawl through Telegram, and they have a really good idea of what's actually going on in, say, the Z Patriot community, what's being discussed, what the latest narratives are. And you don't get any of this and stuff in the Western media. It's at second hand, third hand. So even when there's good commentators or good speakers, they're kind of getting information from you and I sometimes, actually, and so we don't want to sort of have this sort of circle thing where everyone's consuming the same erroneous information. So I think it's absolutely fundamental to go back and listen to Russian language commentators, listen to Ukrainians especially, and what their interpretation is of what's kind of going on. But I noticed with Sullivan. First of all, I started talking about him in 2023 when no one really knew who he was. And who is this guy? Never heard of him. What's the National Security Advisor? What's that role for? But I started pointing out that, like, this guy really doesn't understand either the Russian mindset or how to deal with Putin or how the Kremlin negotiates or doesn't negotiate. Um, doesn't understand the first thing about it. And then, of course, you've got what you call the so-called, nuclear manipulation, the coercive manipulation using nuclear threats. And, I think they really took that to heart. The administration really, really fundamentally believes that and checked their actions. So, yeah, the Sullivan bashing, yeah, I did a lot of that. And that led to me being labeled last year as a Trump lover, which is
I
not exactly the case,
may I,
has to be said.
may I
Yeah,
chime in here,
yeah, yeah.
Jonathan, because I feel that you are just totally right on here with this, with the point, because what I was going to say is that, like it or not, but this Sullivan bashing really kind of led us to where we are today. Because you and I and other people who pay a lot of attention and understand that Sullivan had kind of a wrong philosophy for this approach that wasn't going to be successful, decided that he's so bad that we effectively created an impression that almost anything else would be better because any sensible person would do things differently. Not properly, I guess, informing people that there is a difference and that not liking Sullivan's philosophy is not the same as endorsing Trump. And yet, audiences sometimes made that connection themselves. And that's where you get blamed for being a Trump lover, where that has nothing to do with your point of view. You were just critical of this guy. And I feel the same problem actually is having with Gary Kasparov, who I have tremendous amount for, but he's been so critical of Biden that now he's, the concept that he's just being critical because those things were wrong. It's hard to imagine. So we presume there's kind of a solution that he prefers, and so there was this kind of I think it led people to support Democrats less fervently when they supported Ukraine so much, but they thought that, well, Democrats aren't doing as much as they could. Maybe Trump will come in. He is strong. He will do things better. And I feel like we just kind of ended up feeding into that with Sullivan bashing that ended up
Mm,
really backfiring.
that's it. And I was at pains to point out that there's also a difference between potentially Trump foreign policy, what he may or may not do, and of course internal domestic policy. And I think, I had several people on the channel who, quite specifically, we talked about the near certainty that what you would see is an autocratic slide, the near certainty that what you would see is elements from the autocrats playbook or a transitional autocracy being implemented very early on. So I think we left it sort of ambiguous on my channel, at least. Trump could help Ukraine to win this war very quickly, and here are the levers if he was minded to do so. We did point out that it very likely he wouldn't take those levers and deploy them, but equally we were absolutely fundamentally clear this guy is an aspiring autocrat, and watch out for what happened in Georgia, what happened in Hungary, what happened in Slovakia, or is happening in Slovakia, what happened in Serbia. Watch out for these features of autocratic slide. But of course, if you're in that partisan bubble, you don't want to hear any of that stuff. You're going to tune out and just hear what you want to hear.
I feel the situation is actually worse than that because we're dealing with people who feel like, so what's so bad about being an autocrat? because, if we're going to persuade him, like, oh no, he's an autocrat, like, okay, so that means that he's going to finally solve the problems that have been facing us. But those Democrats with democracies, with their weak solutions and their modeling around, we need somebody who is going to be strong and is going to come and show us the way, which is why so many Russian speakers in America vote for Trump, because they go, oh, I know this one. That this looks familiar. Yes, he will hate all the people that I hate. That's my
And
kind of guy.
and it worked out so well the first 15 times we tried it.
Absolutely. And right now, Trump is saying that the truck drivers need to speak English. What is this but attack on all the Russian speakers out there? I mean, they thought that he was going, everybody for some reason, and we hear this from Wall Street executives as much as from regular people. They thought that Trump wouldn't do all the insane things that he's absolutely intended and said that he was going to do. And at the same time, the fact that he's doing it doesn't, like, the fact that he announced it is not really an excuse. Because, like, oh, I'm going to destroy American economy. We're like, no, you won't. Yes, I will. Well, sure you won't. And we voted for him, and now he's there. He's destroying it. It's still a bad idea. And this is where we get to the key of, I feel the key question of the 100 days is he doing this? Is he a fool, or is he doing this on purpose? Or possibly both. And the deliberateness to which I feel that he is disassembling the United States right now makes me feel that what administration is trying to accomplish is not so much surrender our sovereignty to Russia as just to disintegrate United States. Kind of like it's the, we look around, like, is the mail going to show up? Is the pension going to show up? Is are the airports going to function? I don't know. That's not really a world leader of anything, which, by the way, should remind people that when they want guarantee of security and safety from United States, we in the United States can't get guarantees of security and safety. So how can anybody else demand those kinds of things from us? But that just kind of opens the doors to how the world has changed, and that means that the reality has changed, and the expectations need to be different. And this is where me and Roman Cymbaluk argue, because I feel like the further you are from Trump, the better you are. And Roman says, no, 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 there's no other America. We have to deal with this, president. And so it's a battle.
Some truth in that, of course. But I mean, the other thing I point out, and this became kind of clear to me in the 90s because, despite Yeltsin being our guy and one of the first things we exported apart from Bush's chicken legs during the when food was scarce, we also exported our technology, our political technologists, to try and help keep Yeltsin in power because he's our guy. We don't want the communists to come back. And we helped the nascent democratic process in Russia be hacked almost at the very first opportunity. I mean, there are plenty of willing people like Berezovsky and others who were quite willing to jump on and move that forward. But we certainly gave assistance there, and perhaps did tremendous damage. But what was quite clear to me in the 90s is that what autocrats depend on is not a rich and prosperous and thriving population. Poverty and grievance are fertile ground for autocrats. And my worry here is that what Trump is doing is irrational if you are an economics rationalist and a liberal. But if you want to, go all the way down this autocratic slide, then actually generating new grievances, new poverty, new divisiveness, well, that's grist to the mill.
Well, thanks for saying my things for me. My job here is done. I can go home now. No, you're absolutely right. It is. And it's a really hard, sobering awakening, because it is so difficult for us in America, I feel, to admit that this is maybe happening on purpose. We would much rather think that he's just a really bad chief executive who filed bankruptcy 6 times, which is also kind of a reasonable explanation for things, but not to the extent that you just described. And I kind of tend to agree with you. But however, you did bring up a very important to Russian speakers all over the world point of, it's almost like a rhetorical question or hypothetical called, when did we lose Russia? And my answer to that is you never had it because the only thing you can do in Russia is leave. You can discuss different dates, 96. A popular date is 1993 when Yeltsin shelled from tanks. He, not personally, but shelled the building of Parliament in Moscow. I was already far. I was in America living my life, so I didn't really pay attention to any of this. But from what I understand, that seems to make sense as a point where kind of democracy died again in Russia.
Mm.
But to be
Not the White
fair,
House was populated by Democrats. I met some of these guys and yeah, not exactly Democrats either.
it's Russia for you, I mean, you have on one side, cannibal on the other side. It's a tough choice, and that's the problem because there has to be consequences, and that's what we see right now. Putin avoiding for 25 years is consequences, and this is what Trump is trying to do, create a world where there's no consequences for doing all sorts of things. And my view on this is they function in this system I call like realism. It's Trump realism. When he sits down with Zelensky and says, "How could you do this? Russia is so much bigger. Don't you get it?" Like everybody understands everything. Come on. That's kind of this like philosophy of don't you get it? Surrender. But then there's this reality when it turns out that these things actually don't work like planned. Like the fact that Trump was going to walk out of the negotiations because he wanted to punish Ukraine and show how they're lousy at negotiations. And it turned out he's getting sucked back in by Russia because they need him to be at the negotiations because he's their pathway to get out of sanctions, to get money back, to get all sorts of things. So there's just the fact that there's no consequences, that they thought they could do whatever they want, doesn't mean that reality won't still invade and affect their plans. So I think that's where it's a combination of, on one hand, yes, there is people in democracy that win, that lose, that come to power and leave power, because the key is power, switching hands. But Russia is hardly the place to worry about those kinds of concepts because you have, if it's not going to be Putin, it's going to be some other FSB major or colonel, and and I don't know. So all you can do is just leave. And I'm very grateful to my parents who have since passed on for taking our family out because they weren't like, "Hey, let's stay in Russia and make it a better place." No, they're like, "No, let's get out." Smart.
Yeah, and ultimately, a lot of people make that choice, unfortunately, and generation after generation. I think that I'd be interested to hear your views on this because, one of the first books that I read in Russian, and I find it a little turgid, a little dull actually, but it's Отцы и Дети, Fathers and Sons by Turgenev. Um, but it strikes me that we look for all sorts of causes for the war in Ukraine or Putin's war against Ukraine. His regime stability, his historical obsessions, his loathing of Ukraine for various reasons we can only guess at, and multiple reasons for that. But one of them seems to me that there's a key period of transition around the time of the full-scale war, and that is the transition of power from his generation, who in the 90s stole their way to the top during that sort of brief period of so-called liberalization. It's a point where many of the sort of key business people, mafia and others, are coming to the point of handing these empires over to the next generation as well, which is actually a very dangerous moment because they all know if you stole it, somebody else can steal it off you. And that period of sort of inheritance or transition is can be quite a risky point. Um, is it the lack of these sort of hereditary mechanisms or cultures or institutions to create stable handover and power and wealth, not just with Putin, but throughout his entire elite? That is one of the explanations for what we're seeing here. This massive bloodletting.
I feel that, Jonathan, you're touching on several very important points, and I'll start with negative selection, which I think is what it's often referred to, which is you have the best people leave, you have the best people be killed, you have the nicest people be killed, but best people leave. What's the effect? And from what I'm observing, and it seems that if we're talking about a democracy, that's really terrible. Because when you have the smartest, the most able people in a place where people have, rule in a democratic way, you need those people. Desperately, you need those people. To the point that I appreciate how much volunteers do on our local government level and how much volunteers just get engaged in the community. And those are people who have time and energy and resources. That's so important. But in authoritarian state, people are fundamentally cannon fodder. They're currency. They're part of the exchange rate. And so if you lose one or gain one, doesn't really matter so much. Each individual, it's the corruption, the power struggle is more fundamental than any single person. So when people say that, oh, we need to be good to Russians who have escaped Russia because otherwise they will go back to Russia and they will be strengthening Putin's regime. I was like, you meaningless people, relax. If you want to go back to Russia, you are just going to be meaningless. If you want to have meaning, you want to stay out of Russia. And so, to me, that's just how I separate how different systems treat people and view people. And at the same time, I think that when you talk about generational transfer of wealth and the problems that this can possibly create in Russia, now I haven't lived in Russia since 1988. I went there once in 2019, went to a protest. It was great, not the one that got kicked apart for 2 months later, but anyway. But it's very clear that in Russia, there is no private property in the sense that we understand it in the West, because everything really belongs to the state, because everything belongs to Putin, because in a state where there's no laws and there's just kind of understandings and meanings and you know how things go, everything just kind of drifts up to the top and Putin can take things away. Putin giveth, Putin taketh away. Russia is also a unique situation among the world countries because we have somebody who happens to be in charge of the legal structure, legal power, as well as the illegal power, because he's in charge of the mafia as much as he's in charge of the official state. So everything belongs to Putin. And I think that those kinds of generational changes, there might be some bloodletting, there might be those bulldogs under the carpet, but I don't feel like this will ultimately lead to power changes because we're seeing this coming back to negative selection that who are going to be the next ones? It's going to be Patrushev's Jr. and all those, Putin's got a couple of daughters or maybe more. I mean, now, if this was Elon Musk, who's possibly have hundreds of children, that could be like complicated, or, Saudi Arabia or something. But, it's Russia. FSB is fairly small. They'll work it out.
They'll figure it out, and the worst people will rise to the top, which is what always happens. Absolutely. Um,
In
uh,
Russia.
in Russia, absolutely, and yeah, as I say, the best people are either suppressed, killed, forced to leave, or whatever. But they certainly don't make it near. Now, obviously, you left when you were younger, and until the full-scale war, maybe didn't pay a huge amount of attention to Russia's political system. But now I think it becomes quite interesting, doesn't it? Because we need to try and sort of figure out who is who, who's connected to the regime, who is corrupted, who has formed their worldview based on mythologies, or who is perhaps, I would say, almost sort of, muting their inner moral voice because they know that's not going to fly with the electorate. And we know Navalny did quite a lot of that. For a long time, he couldn't give a clear answer on Crimea because he knew that would alienate the bulk of the people who he thought he was going to rely on to vote. His wife Yulia, I got to be really kind of rude here. I think the ethnic Russian, how shall I call it, the liberal nationalism flows even stronger through her veins. Even someone like Ilyashin maybe, but Karamazov came out and gave the most horrific speech to the French Senate, I think, a couple of weeks ago, where he basically tried to blame all the massacres, the killings, the rapes, the crimes. Yeah, this isn't ethnic Russians, he said, because ethnic Russians can't do these things because we're the same as Ukrainians, essentially. I mean, I managed to get at least three insults that I could count into the same sentence, and blames it on, people from Yakutia and whatever. which is another grave insult because those people are manipulated and controlled by the imperial entity, which is Russia. So you can't absolve yourself of those crimes because you've forced those people into doing those things, created the circumstances whereby that's all they have, and trauma and humiliation is all they've known all their lives. Right, I'll stop the rant there. But this is tricky, isn't it? I don't know if you've been observing the sort of systemic, non-systemic opposition, and how do you figure out who is a good voice to listen to, or who is perhaps in some ways spinning a narrative that may not be quite so healthy?
Well, for that reason, I practically cut off all communication with Russian opposition because because what's the point? I mean, it's a bunch of just BS because look at this. They have no future. First, they have to admit that there's no politics in Russia. And you say exactly, they're hostages to their own electorate, this imaginary electorate of imaginary politics. Once they stop that madness, then it makes sense to talk to them. As long as they're like, people of Russia, calm down, like whatever. So I just don't see a point of that, of taking them too seriously, especially when we look at the definition of difference between in power and in opposition in Russia has to do to what extent you have access to the feeder to the trough. If you have access to the trough, then you're in power. If you were pulled away from that trough for whatever reason, maybe you had morals, maybe you crossed the road for somebody you shouldn't have. Now you're in opposition. And so that doesn't mean that they're liberal, doesn't mean that they're autocratic. They're just not in power. And power is what they look at this because when they look at politics, like I look at politics like, oh, what can I do to help people improve their lives? No, they look at this like, hey, we have a budget. Budget can be cut in different ways, though we can slice this pie in some nice ways. Let's do it with our people. So now they're opposition. I'm sorry, they're not cutting the pie for you. So so I think that that's my point of view on just the general Russian politics and people who pretend to play Russian politicians. That's just silly. But as far as Karamurza, that there's a serious there's and Mrs. Navalny, there's some really big deeper issues there, which is Russian speakers. They're not just authoritarian minded. They're also, if you start digging deeper, often quite racist to the point that they don't even realize that they're racist. They go, well, that's normal, isn't it? Isn't it the truth? Isn't it? And you go, no, sir, ma'am, that's just racism because, that information doesn't bear it out. But they consider that to be common Russian sense. And if you don't have that, then I guess you're like woke or something crazy, and then they dismiss you. So there's some communication problems there. And it's important to acknowledge that Ukrainians really don't care for any of these Russian opposition figures who will say, I support peace. So how much money could you given to Ukrainian army? Nothing. Okay, then what? Then why? Well, because I could get a criminal case in Russia for this. I could lose my property in Russia for this. I could have consequence. Oh, so I guess you're planning on going back to Russia, aren't you? Hmm. And at that point, Ukrainians really kind of separate very quickly from Russians, and Russians go, well, Russian speakers, Russian citizens, whatever. They're like, well, why won't Ukrainians talk to us? Well, I don't know. Why don't you support Ukrainian military? So there's a problem there in communication, and all of these Russian opposition leaders who are also for peace. But the only way, this is where I really respect Garry Kasparov, because he says that the only peace is going to be through Ukrainian military victory, which I 100% agree with. And I think that any politician or somebody who claims to be a politician and says otherwise is just selling hot air because it's not reality. We're seeing Trump administration try a different approach now, and how is that working?
Not so well, I would say there, and whether he starts to sort of understand that he's being mocked by them or not, or whether there's more to it, as you hinted at earlier. I mean, only time will tell. I think Ukrainians some time ago decided that their fate is in their hands, and if they get stuff from the US allies, that's lovely, but fundamentally they have to rely on themselves to dig themselves out of this hole, and I think
It
that's
is
what
it
they've
is an
been doing.
interesting realization because on one hand they're convinced themselves in the United States that without United States there can be no Ukraine. But at the same time, when there is no United States, they're like, well, we're just not ready to die. So the fight goes on.
Yes, this is absolutely right. And just one comment on this fundraisers. I heard an interesting anecdote from someone, and it was an elderly Russian friend she had, who was giving to the armed forces of Ukraine and then stopped. And she asked, "Well, why have you stopped doing that?" She goes, "Well, I was all for them when they were defending themselves, but then they invaded Kursk, and again, I'm like, okay, you know, there's a good
You
reason
know,
why that happened, you
it's
know."
there is a good reason, but this is where I kind of go, you can't fix everything, and I can provide lots of information, but this is a democracy. People are not required to do this. If their heart says that, then you know what, then concentrate on humanitarian aid because there's lots of other ways that you can help. And I think Ukraine is going to need all of it, especially now that instead of having billions and billions of aid, we're talking about letting Ukraine purchase $50 million worth of services. Woohoo!
It's just symbolic, isn't it? Would you say that's an internal sort of political gesture just to try and take some of the heat out of the Trump may be experiencing from some pro-Ukraine or GOP or more Reaganite, if there are any of those left in the Republican circles?
I don't know to what extent that is true anymore because he doesn't really need to worry about dropping it like he used to have a special prosecutor. Those kinds of things were consideration. But it makes me think of what was said about aid during Biden years, where it was called the teaspoon. And I thought, oh, teaspoon, like this is I don't know, maybe drop in a bucket, I guess. That would be, if that was a teaspoon, that this is drop in a bucket. But let's see. I think the key here for me, I'm trying to look at the positive, and I'm seeing that this shows that the Trump administration is able to do business with Ukraine and vice versa. This means that Ukraine is a real country and the United States is recognizing it. Great. Let's keep going forward and push this in a positive direction.
I guess Trump's is the homeopathic remedy to military supplies.
You
Yep.
know,
Not to malign that. I'm sure there's someone in the comments who's going to get terribly offended at that particular comment. Yuri, what an absolute pleasure to speak. I very much hope we get to do this again. And I know the audience are going to love the sort of energy, the passion, I would say, moral grounding behind your answers as well. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
thank you.